welcome to you all. I'm Jordan Small, Executive Director here at the NZ US Council. This is the second in our US election speaker series, and really pleased to have Molly Reynolds from Brookings join us today. I will give a brief introduction for Molly soon. Expecting Leon Grice, the chair, to arrive at any moment. He is, as some of you will know, heavily immersed in the COVID operational team. Today we'll focus on Congress and the races for the House of Representatives and Senate, and why these races are important, and why as a New Zealand audience we should watch them closely, particularly around the policy implications of that final composition of both of those houses. A couple of housekeeping matters before I introduce Molly. This is a recorded webinar, and it will go out via our podcast and social media channels and website, so keep an eye out for that if you want to have a second watch. And please use the various functions there to ask questions. So there's a hand raise function and a Q&A function, and I can either enable you to ask that question, or I'm happy to ask the question on your behalf. So try and get those questions coming in straight away. So if you've got a question you've been thinking about for a wee while on Congress and the various races there, start to fire those in. So let me start by introducing Molly, who is our speaker today. So she is a senior fellow in governance studies at Brookings Institute in DC, and she focuses on Congress, with an emphasis on how congressional rules and procedures affect policy outcomes. And she's an expert on filibustering in the US Senate, which is something I want to ask about later on. She also supervises the maintenance of vital statistics on Congress, which is Brookings' long-running resource on the first branch of government. We first met Molly back at the end of 2018 following the midterm elections, where she gave this awesome presentation, hugely insightful on that new wave of, the Dem wave that characterized those races, and some of the underlying trends there. So was really keen to have Molly be part of this series and give us an update on what's been happening since then. So Molly, welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Jordan. Thanks for having me. It's good to be with you all. This is an appearance that I would be doing virtually regardless of what was happening in the world. But it's good. It's good to be with all of you. So I thought I'd just open with some comments a little bit on kind of the state of the 2020 campaign here in the States. Talk a little bit about some major trends in voting behavior over time. Then I'll talk a little bit about some, as Jordan said, some potential policy implications in the U.S. Congress of what might happen in the 2020 elections in November. So here we are. It's the middle of August. We obviously, the presidential race is what's consuming most of the media attention here. Former Vice President Biden announced yesterday that Kamala Harris would be his running mate. When we think about presidential elections, we generally think that things that matter for the outcome include the state of the economy. There's some disagreement about how exactly we should measure that, how we should think about which of the economic indicators is really most important. It's also increasingly true that for voters, people's evaluations of the economy may or may not actually lead them to change their evaluations of election officials. We used to think that those things were pretty highly correlated, that if you felt like the economy was doing well, you'd reward the incumbent's party. That link has been broken down a little bit in recent elections in the United States. At present, former Vice President Biden is leading in national polls by an average of about 8 points, and that's more or less what the race has looked like since about the middle of June. Obviously, we know that because of the Electoral College in the United States, national polls only tell us part of the story. And so in looking at the national race and the presidential election, really the biggest question for me is in some of these battleground states, in places like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, do voters, largely white voters without college degrees, and I'll talk about that population more in a minute, but large numbers of those kinds of voters turned out to vote for the president in 2016, but stayed home in 2018 in our congressional midterms. Do they come back out in 2020? And if so, do they vote for Trump again? Most of what I want to talk about, though, is races for the House and the Senate. So the Senate, roughly 1/3 of the Senate is up for re-election every 2 years. So this year, that's about 35 seats. And in a given election, that set of seats may be better or worse for Democrats or Republicans, depending on which set of seats are up. So this year, there are actually more seats held by Republicans that are up for re-election than held by Democrats. And really only one of the seats held by Democrats in the Senate that's up for election this year do Democrats expect that they're likely to lose. And that's the Senate seat in Alabama that was won somewhat unexpectedly in the special election in 2017 by Doug Jones. And so that's I think most people expect that seat to flip back to the Republicans. For seats that are held by Republicans, however, there are 6 that most kind of forecasters, me included, think might flip from Republican hands to Democratic hands. And those are races in Iowa, in Maine, in Montana, in North Carolina, in Arizona, and in Colorado. That set of seats that are competitive, that are held by Republicans, has expanded a little bit since over the past 6 months, in part because of Republicans' handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. So if we were having this conversation in January, I would have said that race in Arizona, that race in Colorado are the 2 most likely pickups for Democrats. Now, I think the race in Maine, the race in Montana, in part because Montana Democrats were successful at recruiting probably the strongest possible candidate they could to run in that race. So that's that map, as we would say, has expanded a little bit for Democrats. There are more opportunities for them. The Democrats currently hold 47 seats to 53 seats in the Senate, so they would need to pick up on net 3 seats if there's a Democratic president. So if Vice President Biden wins, Democrats would need to pick up 3 seats in the Senate to have a majority because the vice president breaks ties, and 4 if President Trump were to be reelected. Again, if you had asked me 6 months ago how likely I thought it was that Democrats would take the majority in the Senate, I would have said it's possible, but not particularly likely. I think the chances have increased over the past several months. In the House, meanwhile, I think most folks, me included, expect that Democrats will continue to hold a majority in the House, regardless of the outcome of the presidential election. And that's largely because they made very large gains in 2018 in those midterms. They picked up 39 seats, which is a lot. It's a lot to gain. We talked about this blue wave. I think Democrats may pick up a couple more seats on net in the House, but there's because they picked up so many in 2018, there's only so many seats that are kind of in play that they could additionally pick up. The seats that are in play for Democrats tend to be where they could pick up additional seats and make additional gains, tend to be seats in suburban areas around major cities. And this, I'll note, is the last congressional election that will be contested under the congressional districts that were drawn after the 2010 census in the United States. So the United States redraws its congressional districts for the House of Representatives every 10 years after the decennial census, which is underway as we speak. There has been, so one thing that can happen when you get to the end of a given kind of census period is that you will have had lines that were drawn often to benefit the political party that was in power when the last set of lines were drawn. So in most states, or in many states, Republicans controlled the line drawing process after the 2010 census. But then over time, we may see demographic change in some of those districts that erodes the advantage that in this case the Republicans tried to create for themselves, and that's part of, particularly in some of these suburban districts, what has helped advantage Democrats some. I'm going to say a little bit about some major trends in voting behavior before I talk a little bit about the possible implications of the congressional races for what happens in 2021. So perhaps the most important thing to know about voting behavior in the United States in recent years is that we have a much stronger party line voting than we used to. So by and large, voters who identify as Democrats will vote for Democratic candidates up and down the ballot. Same thing with Republicans. Folks will vote for Republican candidates up and down the ballot. For example, in 2016, it was the first time since the beginning of the 20th century that every state that had a Senate race on the ballot, the Senate race was won by a candidate of the same party as that state gave its electoral votes in the Electoral College. So every state that President Trump won that had a Senate race, the Republican won the Senate race. Every state that had a Senate race that a Democrat won, Hillary Clinton won that state. And so that was, again, the first time that happened since the beginning of the 20th century. So that really demonstrates this link between races at the top and the bottom of the ticket. In 2016, so that means that when we think about congressional races, knowing what's happening in the presidential race is really important. So in 2016, President Trump carried white voters by about 13 percentage points. That gap has closed substantially since then. If the race continues in November at the presidential level to be competitive among white voters, that would really erode some of the structural advantage that Republicans experience, especially in the Electoral College, because in states with even small populations, they have Electoral College votes that generally go to Republicans. In terms of some longer term changes in voting behavior in the United States, again, I'm going to talk here largely about white voters, particularly white voters with college degrees versus without college degrees. So between the early 90s and 2008, white voters without college degrees were divided pretty evenly between Democrats and Republicans. But by 2015, Republicans had a 24-point advantage among those voters. So white voters without a college degree have really moved away from the Republican Party, and white voters with college degrees have moved towards the Democratic Party. Because we know that higher levels of education tend to be correlated with a propensity to vote, that shift has worked in favor of Democrats. I can talk more about voters and changes in voting behavior, but I would like to touch a little bit on sort of what might happen in 2021. So if Democrats do control the House, which most people expect that they will, the presidency, which the current polling suggests is likely, and then the Senate, which I think is a real possibility, we would have unified Democratic Party control in 2021. And as Jordan mentioned, one big question is, would, in this scenario, Democrats in the Senate abolish what we refer to as the Senate filibuster, which is basically the requirement that for most legislation in the US Senate, you need to get to 60 votes to end debate and move to final passage as a result of the US Senate's particular rules. It's As a result, it's much harder to do things in the Senate. And in a world even where Democrats controlled the House, the Senate, and the presidency, it would open up possibilities for Republicans to really obstruct things in the Senate. So it's certainly possible that Democrats in the Senate would eliminate the filibuster in 2021 if they controlled the House, the Senate, and the presidency. The real question, they could do that with only 50 votes. They could, without getting into kind of the weeds of why that's true, they can change the rules with just 50 votes if they wanted to, if there were a Democratic vice president who would be willing to break a tie vote. So I'll sort of stipulate they can do that with 50 votes. The question is there a legislative priority that Democratic majority would be united around and would be willing to make this pretty dramatic rule change to accomplish? Again, if you had asked me 6 months ago, I would have been somewhat skeptical that there was something that a Democratic Senate majority would be that unified on. I think since January, we've seen a couple things happen that suggest to me that maybe there would be something. One is the continuing struggle of the U.S. Congress to mount an appropriately vigorous response to the COVID pandemic. So as we're having this conversation, negotiations have really broken down in Congress, between Congress and the White House, about an additional COVID relief package. We can talk more about that if folks are interested. But I think there's a real possibility that in January, a unified Democratic government, if that's what we have, would really need to pass another vigorous, aggressive COVID response bill. And if Republicans chose to obstruct that, that might be something that Democrats would be willing to eliminate the filibuster for. The other possibility that's emerged in recent weeks, thanks in part to some comments from former President Obama, I believe last week, perhaps 2 weeks ago, at the funeral of civil rights leader John Lewis, President Obama came out and said that he would favor eliminating the filibuster in order to pass new voting rights legislation that would eliminate continued structural barriers of minorities, particularly African Americans, to participate in the electoral process. And that's really telling because President Obama continues to be a very influential figure in the Democratic Party. So if really Obama is coming out and saying this, that may mean that there is increasing pressure within the party to do this. A couple other kind of policy areas that Jordan said folks might be interested in. So in terms of trade, Vice President Biden's plan is somewhat different than some of the prevailing kind of Democratic consensus under President Clinton and President Obama. I think one thing that Vice President Biden has said that is important to remember is that he and a Biden administration would be likely to really prioritize domestic investments in favor of as opposed to really pursuing new trade deals. One thing that I think certainly would be true, regardless of kind of where a Biden administration would stake themselves out on trade, is that trade policy is likely to be much more stable under a Biden administration than it would be or has been under the Trump administration. I would, because we're talking largely about Congress, I would point out that if Democrats take control of the Senate, we would get a new chair of the Senate Finance Committee, which is the committee in the Senate that has jurisdiction over trade issues. That would, I believe, likely be Senator Ron Wyden of Oregon. One of Wyden's most recent sort of activities in this area is he, in 2015, during the Obama administration, worked to reauthorize what we call fast-track trade authority, which is the ability of trade agreements to move through Congress more quickly. And so that, to the extent that that tells us anything about where a Democratic Senate might be going on these issues, that is something that Wyden worked hard for in 2015. The last thing I'll touch on briefly is the possibility of major legislation on climate change. This depends somewhat on the whether the filibuster, as I was talking about before, is maintained. I'm somewhat skeptical that Democrats would eliminate the filibuster to pass climate change legislation. I don't think that's likely to be the precipitating event to get rid of the filibuster, in large part because it's not quite clear to me whether a Democratic Senate majority in 2021 would have broad agreement around a climate change package. This is in part because if Democrats hold this a majority in the Senate in 2021, it would include folks like Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia, who has historically been very pro-coal. West Virginia is a place where they still mine some coal, where mining interests are quite influential, and just some other potential moderate Democrats who might be skeptical of a very broad-based climate package. But it's always hard to know kind of where that would go. So I'm going to stop there and then turn it back over to Jordan for additional questions, and then obviously questions from you all as well.
Well, thanks a lot, Molly. A lot covered there, and plenty for us to pick up on. If anyone has questions, I've enabled a number of you to ask those questions. So either you can unmute yourself and get on and ask the question, or send it through the Q&A and I'll ask it for you. Really keen to get that interactive quality going. Can I bring you right back to one of the very early comments you made, and then there's a number of other points I want to pick up on. But the first was your comment around that the economy is something that perhaps doesn't really factor into voting behavior, yet it's the it's the thing that Trump in particular has been that's been his greatest strength, or his perceived greatest strength, is his management of the economy. Everything else has been we might not like this guy, but at least he manages the economy well. And of course, Corona has ruined that a little bit for him. Can you dig into that point a little bit more, because it seems to be established fact that if you've got a strong economy, then you are a strong candidate for re-election.
Yes. So one thing I'll say that has really sort of emerged over the course of this year in the United States is the disconnect between sort of the performance of the stock market and people's actual experiences with the economy and the economic situation. And so when we, as political scientists, which I am, historically have kind of looked at what predicts the outcomes of presidential elections, and we sort of measure how well the economy is doing, and we've relied on things like how well the stock market is doing. It's become increasingly clear that that doesn't necessarily help us predict outcomes maybe as much as it once did. And part of this is also, as I was saying, something that started to emerge really during the Obama presidency, but I think is continues to be true now, that affects how we think about this, is that people's perceptions of how the economy is doing are also filtered through their pre-existing political attitudes. So the idea that if you are a fan of President Trump, you may be more likely to think the economy is doing well, really absent whatever the objective economic indicators tell you. And conversely, if you're a Democrat, you may be more likely to think the economy is doing poorly because you don't like President Trump. So kind of evaluations of the economy are becoming more tied up with people's partisanship than they once were, which is part of why it's harder to use some of these economic fundamentals to develop expectations about what's going to happen in the election.
Yeah.
I am seeing, Jordan, do you want me to just take the some of these questions that are coming in the chat?
Yeah, why not?
Okay.
Yeah.
So I see a question here that says, would you asked me to expand on my comments in terms of climate change, the elimination of the filibuster. To what extent are Democrats united behind Biden's recently released plan on climate change? So I don't have a great sense of sort of where Democrats in the Senate are on that plan specifically. I do think that, again, as we think about the prospects of climate change legislation in 2021 with a Democratic Senate, that is a place where the fact that any Democratic Senate majority is going to include some senators who are more moderate on some of these issues is likely to be an obstacle to doing that. One thing I will say is that there are certain things that could be done and need to be done legislatively. There are also important things that can be done without legislation, can be done through the executive branch. We've seen the Trump administration do some of these things to roll back some important environmental regulations during the Trump administration. In general, the Trump administration has been, perhaps not to say that they haven't been effective at rolling back regulations in the environmental arena and elsewhere, but they've been perhaps less effective than one might have expected, because they've basically tried to cut a lot of corners in the regulatory process. So in the United States, in order to do things through regulation, there are a lot of very prescribed steps that you have to go through. We have something called the Administrative Procedures Act that prescribes how regulations have to be kind of written and promulgated. And the Trump administration has been challenged in court on a number of their high-profile efforts to change things using regulation. And their efforts have been struck down because they haven't kind of gone through exactly the steps that they were supposed to. So thinking again about what might happen in a Biden presidency, in addition to the possibility of things moving through Congress, I think it's important to remember that I would expect a Biden presidency to just be more effective at using the tools of the executive branch to achieve policy change across a wide range of policy areas, including in the environmental space.
Excellent. A similar question from Sam. Hi, Molly. Where is the voting population at on climate change, and how does that align with the respective parties?
Yeah, so in general, my sense is that I haven't looked at sort of this polling data particularly recently, but in general, Democrats are more supportive of legislation and efforts to address climate change than Republicans are. There is some interesting generational divisions. So there is some evidence that younger Republican voters, while let me take one step back and say that generally younger people in the United States are overwhelmingly a Democratic voting bloc. But to the extent that there are sort of millennial Gen Z Republicans, they tend to be more in favor of governmental action to address climate change than older Republicans are. But there is, I think, continues to be a pretty strong partisan divide in terms of certainly how important of an issue climate change is. Democrats tend to say it's much more important than Republicans do, and so that is certainly relevant as we think about the prospects for climate change legislation. It's part of, I think, among the reasons we haven't seen the U.S. act aggressively on this so far.
Yep, keep those questions coming through. So there's a number of big name Republicans, senators, who are looking a little bit shaky. I'm thinking of Cory Gardner. I'm thinking of Susan Collins, and they're widely regarded as quite moderate Republicans. Are we likely, or are we seeing yet Republican senators starting to break away from the president, at least, either publicly, so starting to distance themselves from a president that's quite unpopular, or are they doing that more subtly, or are they doing anything?
So I'll say a couple of things. So one, there's been sort of throughout the Trump presidency, there's been some kind of more subtle pushback from some Senate Republicans on a certain set of issues, but it's largely been behind the scenes. I think what's been telling actually in recent weeks, to the extent that we've seen some Republicans try to distance themselves from the president, it's actually been less on sort of trying to push back against things that the president has done that are particularly offensive or egregious in some way, and more looking sort of some signals that some Republican senators perhaps expect the president to lose re-election, and as a result are trying to position themselves for what would happen if there's a Democrat in the White House in 2021. So it's been a little bit less some more moderate Republicans trying to distance themselves from the president because they think it's going to help them win re-election in November. We see that occasionally. But I do think what's been telling over the past couple of weeks is that we have seen some Republican senators, here I'm thinking about folks like Ted Cruz of Texas, Ben Sasse of Nebraska, really try to put some distance between themselves and the president in preparation for potentially staking out kind of an obstructive position in should Joe Biden and win the election. And so we've seen this in particular with arguments around why Republicans are not eager to pass more COVID relief legislation. They've really started to talk again more about the size of the debt and the deficit, which they were not particularly vocal on, say, when Republicans passed a large tax cut in 2017, which obviously increased the deficit. But some Republican senators have started to use that rhetoric again, to my mind, potentially in anticipation of trotting that rhetoric back out again under a Democratic president in 2021.
Yeah, that's something that's been really interesting to see, is that the tensions or the dynamics within the GOP being exposed on that coronavirus relief package. So quite interesting to see that. We've got a couple more questions, and of course from Tim McCready. It's a good question on your view on how Kamala Harris's selection as VP.
Yeah, so I think. So in on one level, I think the selection of Harris was not a particularly big surprise. I think that Biden had indicated quite some time ago that he was likely to, I think he said he was certainly going to pick a woman, and then there was kind of an emerging consensus that he was likely to pick a Black woman. Not only in response to the kind of period of racial unrest that the U.S. Has been experiencing particularly acutely since the beginning of the summer, but obviously also Black women are perhaps the most loyal voting bloc within the Democratic Party. So the idea that picking a Black woman as his vice president would be a particularly important. I think that because Harris is Biden has not himself been in the Senate since he left to become Obama's vice president, but he is a creature of the U.S. Senate. So I think that picking a fellow senator was probably also an appeal to him. And so in terms of how it's likely affect the race. There's very little evidence that historically who the vice presidential pick has a lot of outcome on kind of how people actually choose to vote in the presidential election. It generally doesn't matter a whole lot. But to the extent that it does, it matters because it sends a signal to voters about how the president might govern. What are things the president thinks or are important. And so in that sense, picking someone who has a pretty progressive voting record in the Senate, I think is important. You haven't seen a whole lot of opposition to Harris as the pick kind of emerge over the past 24 hours from other factions within the Democratic Party. So I think and the hope certainly is that having Harris on the ticket helps energize and helps make it easier to turn out voters, particularly Black voters in the fall. Well, like I said, Black voters, particularly Black women, are already quite reliably Democratic voting bloc. So we'll see how much more that's activated with Harris. But by and large, like I said, even as Democrats as a party have tried to kind of chart a path between a more moderate wing and a more progressive wing, you haven't seen a huge amount of organized opposition to the Harris selection in the past day or so.
Yeah. So you say the choice of VP is not all that influential for voting behavior. It is true, though, that the office of the vice president has become more powerful probably in the last 20 odd years. Could you comment a little bit around that and what that selection tells us in terms of how Biden might govern?
Yeah, so I mean, I think most importantly, in part because Vice President Biden has indicated that were he to be elected president, he is likely to choose to not run for re-election, that he would sort of in 2024, that he might be willing to sort of stand aside and let someone else run. So in that sense, there's a degree to which picking whoever he picks for vice president is automatically the front runner. I mean, that's true even if he were to run for re-election and win. There's a certain sort of front runner status that gets bestowed on whoever the vice president is if he or she chooses to run. In terms of thinking about kind of the role of the vice president in governing, President Obama, when he selected Vice President Biden, there was sort of an agreement between the two of them that Biden would be quite involved in the policymaking process. And I suspect that Vice President Biden would continue that approach with Senator Harris were he to win. And then thinking obviously about some of Harris's own background and some of the issues that she's worked on a lot. So she was the Attorney General of California before she was elected to the Senate. That past as a prosecutor has been an area where she's been criticized from some folks on the left. So it'll be interesting to see what role that plays both in the campaign and should Biden be elected and Harris become vice president. But it's I think sometimes when you think about why a certain person is picked as the vice presidential candidate, it's often to kind of complement strengths of the person at the top of the ticket and to sort of fill in weaknesses. And so obviously Vice President Biden has a very long track record in Washington and quite a lot of foreign policy experience. So when we think about some of the other folks who were possible picks, so Susan Rice, for example, who was kind of on the short list, her background is also in foreign policy. Biden didn't really need a foreign policy person to balance out his own experience. He has that himself. So selecting someone who is younger, who has a little bit of a different issue portfolio, I think is part of what we saw happening there.
Yeah. So Harris is likely to be a very domestically focused.
I think so. Certainly, if you look at her her background and what she worked on in the Senate, worked on before the Senate, and again, because Biden himself has so much foreign policy experience, I suspect that he would make that more of a focus. Although obviously, I think, given kind of where we are right now, for the entire administration, the biggest focus come January, were Biden to win, beyond kind of domestic COVID response. I think given kind of where we are in the States on that, that's going to be the biggest priority in January period.
Sure. Keep those questions coming through. We've got a question there from Sam. Let's pick that one up, and then I want to get us to back to gaming out a couple of possibilities in terms of the mix between presidency, the House, and Senate, and what that might mean for policy. But let's pick up Sam's question there.
Yeah, so Sam asks about younger voters and where they are in voting participation, whether millennials are now at a very significant demographic in the U.S. That's absolutely true. I don't remember exactly kind of what share of the voting population millennials now comprise. But it is one thing that did happen in 2018 is that we actually saw much higher levels of participation among younger voters than we usually do in a midterm election. So generally in midterm elections, we see across the board participation be lower, more voters turn out in presidential years than in midterm years. But it is that was less true in 2018, and so it'll be interesting to see in 2020 sort of what the level of participation is among younger voters. Though notably, the oldest millennials are actually not that young anymore. They're pushing 40, and so we have millennials, and then sort of the Gen Z generation behind them.
Yeah. Let's look at a few combinations. So we have between the presidency, the House and Senate, and quite keen to understand what that might mean on the policy front, both domestically and in terms of foreign policy. So if we have a Biden presidency, Dems House stays the same, and then a Dems Senate. So you have that clean sweep for the Dems. And we saw this in 2009, right, with Obama. And it was a very limited window of opportunity where he took the opportunity, I guess, to push through healthcare reform. And some say he missed the opportunity to also pursue climate change measures, gun reform, that type of thing. So where would you expect a Biden administration and a Dems Congress, where would you expect them to start? I mean, what would be, if it is a limited window, what would be the thing they would pick up and run with?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's, I think, a really important dynamic in U.S. politics generally, and certainly one that we saw, frankly, on display both in the beginning of 2009 with unified Democratic control, and to some degree at the beginning of 2017 in that period of unified Republican control. Is that there is this sense that there's only so much time before folks in Congress, particularly in the House, start to worry about running for re-election in the midterms. One of the kind of biggest regular trends in American politics is that the president's party loses seats in his first midterm election. So again, we saw that happen in 2010 when Democrats lost control of the House. We saw it happen in 2018 when Republicans lost control of the House. So I think there would certainly be concern under hypothetical unified Democratic Party control in 2021 that there is this narrow window. In terms of what I think the kind of first, and so to my mind, one of the most important things that Democrats should maybe be doing behind the scenes right now is kind of trying to figure out what are the big things that they would want to use that very early window to do. The two things that I think are kind of highest on the agenda, one is, again, I think probably continued response to the COVID pandemic. I think in this way, there are some similarities to what the Obama administration faced at the beginning of 2009 with needing to pass an additional economic stimulus bill to respond to the financial crisis in 2008. Just given kind of where we are health-wise and the state of the pandemic, and also how difficult it's been for Congress to respond to it so far, I think that's again likely to continue to be very high on the agenda in early 2021. And then beyond that, I would say again this growing sense that some sort of voting rights, democracy reform legislation would also be a prominent agenda item at the beginning of 2021. I think I thought this was a possibility even before former President Obama came out last week or the week before in favor of eliminating the filibuster for this kind of legislation. At the beginning of 2019, when Democrats first came into their majority in the House after the 2018 elections, the first big piece of legislation they passed was a democracy reform bill, HR 1, and that signifier is usually used on something that the majority party thinks is really important. It gets that number, that House resolution number 1. As a signal that it's a top policy priority. They knew it wasn't going to go anywhere in the Senate, where the Republicans have the majority, but again, they kind of got behind it as the party's biggest policy and most important policy proposal in early 2019. So I think those two things are likely to be kind of the highest items on the Democrats' agenda if there is unified party control in 2021, and then how quickly they could try and move those, whether it would take eliminating the filibuster to get either of them done, whether they choose to do that. Those are all sort of open questions for me.
Sure. So we saw, I can't even remember, I think it was last year. The years have seemed to have merged. But the USMCA passed through the House, passed through Congress, the House and Senate, and managed to collect together the needed votes to get that through. Do you expect this will be the last major trade deal we'll see for a while?
So it's a good question. So I mentioned before that one of to the extent that we have any sense of kind of where a Biden administration is likely to be on trade, if that is what happens in November, is that I think they again are likely to prioritize kind of a domestic focus at the early on over things like new trade deals. Again, that's not to say that that wouldn't happen. I think one of the things that has been interesting to me as an observer of U.S. politics over the past 5 years or so is the way that sort of Republicans have changed their their position on trade. So obviously Republicans used to be a much more pro-free trade party. Trump has kind of shuffled that up a little bit. And one of the things that's true about voters is that trade is not often an issue that's really top of mind for a lot of American voters, except in the ways that it kind of trickles down into more things, excuse me, that are a little bit more visible to them. And then there are obviously some very specific exceptions. So as we've seen with Trump's tariff policies, there are certain places in the country that have been really adversely affected by those. But if you look at polling data on trade over time among voters, they really take their cues from elites of their party. So as Republican elites have moved on trade, so have Republican voters. And so kind of what that means going forward, I think is a little bit of an open question. But again, I think that if Vice President Biden wins, that the kind of early focus of the Biden administration is likely to be much more domestic than it is on things like big trade deals.
Yeah. It is interesting to observe from here that China will be a major issue in this election, and certainly at the presidential level, it's who is tougher on China. How does that play through with the voting public?
Yeah, so American voters don't generally pay a lot of attention to foreign policy issues, except when they become extremely salient for some reason or another. And so obviously I think at the beginning of this year, with the emergence of COVID in China, and presidents kind of messaging around that might have been one of those moments where folks started paying more attention to China, and with U.S. involvement in conflicts overseas at moments that can kind of activate the American public's attention towards foreign policy issues. But generally, again, I think most U.S. voters are much more focused on domestic, economic, and other conditions. And so in that sense, while I think the rise of China will be a major issue for either a continued Trump administration or a Biden administration to face, I don't really expect it to play a particularly big role in how voters make their decisions about who to vote for in November.
Yeah. All right. So we're getting, we've got 5 more minutes to go. Well, 7 minutes. Keep those questions coming through. We could possibly get through a couple more through to Molly. I've got a couple more to fill in the space. And I want to bring you back to the filibuster rules. And I know it's an area of particular expertise for you. And there is, we've talked about it, this talk of the Dems getting rid of the filibuster. Could you talk us through that a little bit more, and why it's important, and where that momentum is coming from this time around to get rid of it, because there has been that talk for a while, and there are certain there's pros and cons. Could you talk us through that?
Yeah, so the kind of basic history of the filibuster is that it kind of was created in the early 19th century as a fluke of U.S. history. It's not in the Constitution. It is true that the American founders imagined the Senate to be a slower moving, more deliberative body than the House, but they did not write into the Constitution a supermajority requirement for things in the Senate. They did not imagine that the Senate would be a place that only operated with supermajority support. But again, in the early 19th century, as sort of a quirk of a change in Senate rules, it opened up this possibility of extended debate There was, until the beginning of the 20th century, no way in the Senate to cut off debate with a simple majority vote. In 1917, the Senate creates this option for cutting off debate with a supermajority vote. And that's sort of where we've been since then. What it means is that, particularly since the mid-1970s, that it's been basically impossible to get any legislation through the Senate without having 60 votes in favor of it to end debate, which has really empowered the minority party in the Senate, whoever that might be. So right now, it is. It is the Democrats for the last 2 years of the Obama administration. It was the Republicans. And so the idea is that you have to get some number of senators from the other party, not the majority, to go along with you to get something done. And so one of the reasons that it was really difficult for Democrats to get things done in the later part of the Obama administration is because Republicans in the Senate didn't want to cooperate. And one of the reasons why it's difficult to get things done now is because you need the Democrats control the House, Republicans control the Senate, but you need to get some sort of compromise, and you need to get some Democrats to go along with what you're trying to get through the Senate. And so it really it makes it more difficult to get things to the Senate. The fact that the parties in the United States are quite polarized, Republicans and Democrats have very divergent views on things, means that it's, again, harder to get to that 60 vote threshold. It's also the case, though, that because since about 1980 in the United States, there's been pretty even levels of partisan competition across the political system, that both parties kind of look at the next election and think, oh, I could win the majority or I could lose the majority. That level of competition really, I think, affects the party's sense of what might happen when the next time they lose. So if you are, say in early 2021, if you are the Democrats and you do have a majority in all three chambers and you think, okay, we could eliminate the filibuster now to get more things done that Republicans are obstructing, that they're not coming along with us to get to that 60 vote threshold. But what happens if we lose, the next time we lose the majority and there's a Republican president in the White House? What are the kinds of things that a Republican majority could do that would be really really bad for the voters who generally support Democrats? And so that kind of time horizon calculation, I think, is part of what has kept the filibuster around as long as it has. It also empowers individual senators. So if you think, you need to get to 60 to get something through the Senate, if you are that sort of 58th, 59th, 60th senator who the majority party is trying to get on board, you have a lot of leverage. And so because it takes votes from individual senators to change the rules, they're thinking about, where is my power now? Where might my power go if we change the rules, versus what policies could we get done in the absence of the filibuster that we're not able to get done now. So that's kind of why it's important. It does make it more difficult to forge compromise. It contributes to the level of gridlock in the American political system.
Yeah. I think that's well, it's not a great place to leave it on the thought of gridlock.
Place to leave it. Not a particularly optimistic place, but I think I agree, a fitting place to leave our conversation.
Yeah, and that will be, particularly if there is a Dems or Biden and then a Dems House, that filibuster question will be quite important, I think, to work through if you want to get those big policy reforms happening. And so I think it's definitely a conversation that we should have here as well, and to understand that. But we have reached the top of the hour, and do want to be respectful of people's time, including your own. And thank you very much for sharing your insight today. And boy, it's an interesting political time, and the races, and I can't wait to watch it as a political junkie. But so yeah, great to have you talk us through that a bit. So thank you very much.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me, and I'll be happy to join you all again after the election to recap what we've seen.
Oh, that'd be fantastic. Let's do that.
All right. Have a great day, everyone.
Yeah, have a nice evening. Thank you.